Welcome back, everyone. Thank you very much for coming back for the next session. That's always a good sign, isn't it? It shows you how much you enjoyed that wonderful first session. Now we're going to be talking about plotting the course, which is exploring the strategy and the practice needed to bring heritage tourism to the forefront in Queensland. We'll be hearing from two speakers, both sharing state government and a local government perspective on tourism strategies, policies and frameworks. We'll also be viewing for the first time an example of some of the heritage stories from across Queensland that have recently been digitised and are being used in new and exciting ways to capture the interest and the imagination of locals and tourists alike. We'll then conclude this session before lunch with what I'm sure will be very interesting and timely discussion about how we Queenslanders can value Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and create new tourism experiences. So let's get underway. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Therese Phillips is Director of Partnerships at Tourism and Events Queensland, TEQ, and she's worked in and experienced tourism in most continents of the world and owned a specialist travel agency taking Australian school children to Egypt, Israel, Turkey and Greece. Therese also had the privilege of working with the Olympic Games Cultural Committee in the years leading up to the Sydney Olympics, and has worked with colleagues to coordinate the TEQ response to the G20 event in Brisbane just last weekend and the 2018 Gold Coast Commonwealth Games event. Therese has held board positions with a variety of regional tourism organisations, including Director of the Australian Regional Tourism Network since 2008, and has been committed to ensuring Queensland's regional tourism businesses and their issues are represented at a national level. Please make her welcome, Therese Phillips.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Tourism and Events Queensland and how we fit into the puzzle, and then try and unpack a little bit of the way that heritage and cultural tourism can work with us and how we can work with you. So hopefully that's something that's going to be of interest to you, but obviously any questions that come up I can look to address at the appropriate time. So Tourism and Events Queensland is a statutory authority. What that means is we are relatively arm's length from the department, but having said that, we sit in the portfolio of tourism, small events, Commonwealth Games, small business and everything else that sits in that one. But one of the really good things that has changed over the last little while is that tourism has become one of the 4 pillars of government. And why do I say that's a really good thing? For the first time, we have the ability to actually speak to a whole lot of other government departments who didn't really talk to us very much. And I certainly don't mean the Department of Heritage or the Department of Arts. I'm meaning things like Department of Main Roads. So when we would go along, Mark in a previous life was in charge of our whole drive tourism push, and we would go along to the main roads and we'd say, please sir, we'd just like you to talk about this road between Emerald and Rockhampton, and they'd say, you don't need to talk about that, that's just a mining trail, so you don't need to talk about that at all. And we'd say, but we have these things called caravanners that drive along that road and it's quite dangerous, sir. And they'd say, you need to go and have a look at the 10-year forward plan, and if you can't see your name on it, then come and talk to us in 11 years and we'll see what we can do. So, none of that was useful, and that's why Mark left. No, that's not why Mark left. No. So, the really good thing is, now that we're a pillar, people have to talk to us. Isn't that exciting? What that does mean is that we can assist in the state delivering a much more coordinated effort when it comes to tourism. So your next question is, of course, do we do it well? And my answer would have to be, not overly. And a lot of that is to do with the sheer volume of people who now want to talk to us. So the old adage of be careful what you wish for is so true. We wanted everyone to talk to us and now they are, and we just can't cope. No. So one of the good things is that tourism is rooted in real people. The tourism industry is real mum and dad operators for the majority, real people that we can get to talk to, and we know them. We know a lot of them intimately. So the reason I put that graph up is just to show you that more than half of the real people running tourism businesses don't employ anyone. They don't have to fill out a BAS. They're making the beds, they're changing the sheets, they're they're doing the jam in the morning, they're checking people in, they're checking people out, they're doing everything. So the reason I say that is when later on we talk about the fact that you should be dealing a little bit more with your tourism industry, I'm kind of setting you up to fail in some ways because you're dealing with people who are already working 22 hours a day. And so for them to engage with their local heritage property is just another thing. So we need to make it easy. There's only 200 businesses, or just over 200 businesses, that employ 200 or more people. So it's tiny, it's itty-bitty, but each one of those companies sits in a community, and each one of them is actually the lifeblood of what their community has to offer. So those tourism experiences, in some circumstances, change the face of what a community is. So an example that I try and truck out all the time is my favourite, Boulia. Boulia was looking at a declining population and a declining reason for living. The current government at the time had decided that any community under 3,000 was what they called marginal. And so they were working through a process. This is a little bit of secret women's business, but it was a long time ago. They were working through a process of actually closing down some of those communities. So Boulia, someone, for the reasons best known to themselves, opened up a pie shop. The pie shop gave people, and the pie shop started to get a little bit of a reputation, so it gave people another reason to stay. The motel built 2 more units. The hotel upgraded their accommodation and put in a bottle-o. The local council, in partnership with us and the federal government, put a little attraction out there. So all of a sudden, Boulia, which was marginal in the economic terms, has become viable. Now, are we responsible for everything? No. But we're certainly a really important part of that story. And I think that gets lost in a lot of the conversations that happen, particularly in the halls of government. I see you as exactly that fabric that we are dealing with. So as much as the pie shop, if it wasn't for the fact that a gentleman whose name I can't remember bought some dinosaur bones in from the outskirts and set them up in that little... Dick, yes. Yes, okay, Dinosaur Dick. If it wasn't for Dinosaur Dick giving another reason to stop, that's exactly it. And there's a Dinosaur Dick in every town. And not necessarily because they have dinosaur bones. Exactly. Oops. Anyway, so I see heritage in the same way that I see tourism. I see you as creating that experience, that reason for people to stay another day, to buy another pie, to have another experience. So we work together. So if I put up an example of your attributes, your heritage attributes, I'd be looking at small things. Sydney Opera House is a heritage attribute, but it's kind of in the little bit of the pie that we sit with our 200 plus. The majority of your heritage attributes sit with the rest of us. We're all small and we're all struggling. So that's my little story. We have a vision like everyone else. It's collaboration, and we now have events in our name. So what we're doing is trying to provide a sense for everyone to work together and to get the ownership. And why? We're all driven by econometrics. We want to get $30 billion in overnight visitor expenditure by 2020. That's extreme. I'm going to show you some graphs in a minute just so that you can share our nervousness about how extreme it is. But if you don't have an aspirational goal, then you become mediocre. So we could try and achieve what we know we can, pat ourselves on the back at the end of the day and say we've done it, or we can put something out there into the ether that we probably will never achieve, but at least we'll try. So that's our vision. 15 billion in 2010 to 30 billion in 2020. So there's the lines. The top line is what we like to call the aspirational level. As you can see, we're actually close, but when you're talking about billions, it's a little far. The forecast line, which is the one that we absolutely will nail, is the one that we probably would have gone to in older times. So what would normally happen is our leaders would say to us, well, what's a reasonable target? And we probably would have looked at that target and said, well, this is reasonable. and we will have all achieved it. And so I say we pat ourselves on the back. Whereas we're all a little bit nervous about the fact that we are quite a ways underneath the top blue line. And so that means that we become more focused in what we're going to do, and we try and figure out how we are actually going to work together to get that. We've also set ourselves another challenge. So overnight visitor expenditure, who doesn't that count? All of those cruise ships along the coast, because they don't stay on the mainland in an overnight accommodation. All of those free camping spots, don't count them. The majority of our caravan parks, they don't get counted. So we've actually set ourselves up with a really tall order. We're only counting the accommodation that's registered as an accommodation provider. So that's the motels, the hotels, along those lines. B&Bs, but not all. So, yeah, 2020. Hopefully I'll be retired by then and someone else can stand up in front of Senate estimates, explain why we haven't got there. No, didn't say that out loud either. So, the thing you've got to understand about the tourism industry is it's complex. It's so good. I think it would be great if I worked for the Department of Mining or the Department of Agriculture and I'd just have one blob on the screen and I'd say there are 6 miners in Australia. They're really big, you can take them to tea. But with our industry, it's so complex. So we go from local tourism organisations who are funded by local councils and funded by membership, and they basically they should be looking at industry product development. So they should be the people working with their local industry to make sure everything's good. Then we go to regional tourism organisations, and they're at the destination. So a regional tourism organisation in the worst case is Outback, a third of the state. One regional tourism organisation, 18 odd councils, hundreds of stakeholders, very few ratepayers. So that's an extreme of a regional tourism organisation. The other extreme, Gold Coast. Small, contained, one local council, a really strong emphasis on tourism. So what they should be looking at is they're looking at their own backyard and how they make their experience absolutely ticking along and how they promote their experience to themselves and 400k and in some cases interstate, and they're the bigger guys. For the smaller guys, just around the 400k and within the intrastate. And then the events. So Tourism Events Queensland, what we are is, and I'm going to show you a little map to show you where we are, we sit in the space of trying to be a coordination unit. We're certainly the marketing body for the state. We certainly look at experience development and how we can integrate that into a marketing activity. And we certainly try, as best we can, to take that messaging internationally. So we certainly look Melbourne, Sydney, and overseas to the 17 different offices that we have over there, and a little bit within the state. But there's just not enough of us to spread around, and you'll have a look at that at the minute. So what we do is tactical marketing, and by tactical marketing, you can read into that really fabulous PR and advertising. So some of the things you might have been involved in recently, we had the biggest Insta-meet. We held the biggest Insta-meet on October the 4th, I think it was. And we were trying to get a Guinness Book of World Records for the Insta-meet. Used to be held by San Francisco. They got 250 photos. We got 6,000. So we did it. We got 6,000 images of sunsets and sunrises, and they were posted, and the visibility for Queensland just goes exponentially when you can do something like that. So we can do that because we can clear our headspace. We don't change beds, we don't clean up the toilets, we don't do any of those sort of things. We can focus on that really strong marketing outcome. And then, of course, Tourism Australia, and they do destination marketing from a national perspective. So a little bit of replication, except we all work together, so there's not. They have offices overseas, we do. They generally share the same office space, so we all get to talk together. Some of the neat things they do, you might have seen Restaurant Australia, which they've just launched down in Hobart last week. That's a national program that all of the states and territories bought into. But Tourism Australia do it on our behalf because they've got a few more staff and a lot more money. So that's the continuum of what we call the tourism industry. So we have 13 regional tourism organisations. When I say we, that's a loose word. We, the state government, fund partially all of those regional tourism organisations. But they're all independent bodies, they all have boards of directors, they all have CEOs. So we can influence, but we can't force anyone to do anything. And as I say, those regional tourism organisations go from huge tasks of land with very little budget down to small with a lot of budget. Great focus, limited focus. So they're very, very different beasts. We have 17 spots around the world. We actually have a couple of tiers of countries that we work into. So you'll often hear about, why aren't we in Russia? Well, Russia's on our wish list. It's a country that we believe we could get a good bang for our buck as far as visitation's concerned, but we don't have an office there. So what we do is we ask the representatives that are in the UK and Europe to extend their boundaries a little bit so that they can move into some of those other countries. We don't have an office in South America, for example, but that's another country, or that's another group of nations that have been identified as showing great potential back to us. We have one team that looks after mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and they're a team of 3. So again, our ability to influence is strong as it is by wonderful staff, but we can't get everywhere at every time. So we need to focus a little bit. The growth, so this is the kind of scary bit. You have a look at the dots. The dots are actually relative to the size of the potential for that region. So the bigger the dot, the bigger potential, the smaller the dot, the smaller potential. So if you have a look around the world, you'll notice a couple of things there. Obviously, domestic is the one place that we have the greatest influence over because people know us, and it's also what has been determined by the research people as the place that we will have our greatest potential. The downside of that is that Queensland has seen a flat line in domestic visitation for about 6 or 7 years now. So we need to figure out what we're not doing so that we're taking up that potential. And part of it could be the heritage and cultural tourism space. China is a big dot. It's a really good dot, but the one thing that we're known for is nature. Great Barrier Reef is on the top of every Chinese person's wish list, so we're very lucky, unlike Melbourne, who don't have a Great Barrier Reef, we do. The things that we would like to think that the Chinese people might be interested in, they don't see us as owning. So, for example, history and heritage, they think we're too young. So they look to Europe for history and heritage. So even though we have great history and heritage stories, we haven't yet worked out what the words are to actually encourage people to come here. So that's a challenge for us. UK has been flatlining. A lot of that had to do with the global financial crisis and the fact that there was no money around. The same with Europe has actually, some parts of Europe, Italy for some reason, we don't actually know why, but it's been doing well. But a lot of the rest of Europe has been a little bit flatlining. We're hoping as the economies over there change a bit that we might actually start to see a lot more people coming here. Things like the G20, because you look at America, things like the G20 actually will make an impact. When Bill Clinton went to Cairns, we could visibly see a spike in awareness and visitation from America into Cairns. So if we could get Mr. Obama to come back with his wife and children and snorkel on the Great Barrier Reef, that would be fabulous. We have about an 18-month to 2-year window for that before he becomes not as popular as he is now, or at least in that emphasis. So there's a couple of things that we look at that are quite odd. So we will really work at getting him to come back. If we could have got Angela Merkel to go to the Sunshine Coast, that would have been fabulous. We didn't. She went to Melbourne, and that was a shame. But there's things like that that sit in the background, and that's one of those great things about other people now talking to us. So our trade team now involve us in conversations when missions are going to overseas places to say, what would you like to say? And so we can fill them in. So that's all the background. I hope that was useful in some way. But it does give context a little bit to the conversation that we're about to have. So heritage sits within cultural tourism, within most of the international definitions. There's no singular definition that sits in either, unfortunately. And the constant debate between owners of cultural heritage and cultural tourism is the challenge between showing people where it is and conserving it and keeping it in its current pristine or not so pristine place. So, for our perspective at Tourism and Events Queensland, we believe we are just as responsible to make sure that the cultural and heritage product in Queensland is maintained to the level that it is. So we don't believe that bringing an extra million or billion Chinese people into Queensland for the sake of getting our OVE up is actually what we should do. So rest assured, we're not going to rape and pillage in the same way that we might have done years ago. But what we do try and do is to say, potentially, what can we do? Now, I use a National Trust example, and I believe there's a National Trust person here. Hello. So I'm not going to offend you, but I'm going to use an example. I thought I'd just let you know. When I was very young and I went to Great Britain and I had my National Trust brochure and I went looking for these National Trusts because I had my years pass that got me into every one in the book, and I turned up to a hillock with one stone on it and looked at it and thought, okay, so this is the castle that was very impacting in the 1300s. Yeah, there's a stone. So that's hard. That's hard for a tourism person to sell, although they did it really well because I went there, didn't I? And so did lots of other people. So we need to understand, we need your help to understand what the heritage value is for certain products and how we can present it back to people and how we can help you preserve that product so that it doesn't get overrun. The UNESCO definition of creative tourism, which is one of the ones that most people use, has the word heritage in it, which I think is really good, because that means that we can go back to our bosses and say that that's something that we should be emphasising. One of the things that the UNESCO folks say is that these are all the things that a cultural tourism person will do, and you'll notice that the very last dot point is particularly focused around heritage. In Australia, because Europe owns that space, we haven't nailed it for whatever reason. And maybe it is we don't talk to the right people or we don't use the right language. But we don't have a reputation internationally or even nationally as having an amazing heritage offering. So that's something that we need to work on. The one thing that's the shiny beacon is that, and I think Mark spoke about this earlier on this morning, cultural and heritage activities have actually been identified as one of the things with a bullet. They're growing. They're going to continue to grow. And even though the numbers are quite small, they spend. And they do tend to stay a little bit longer so they could get that grassy hillock and make sure they get to it. They do want an individual experience though. So the example of coming into a state and saying, yeah, we've got great heritage, just won't wash, because people want to delve down into whatever that means and get a greater understanding of how they can experience that particular authentic travel experience, individualised if at all possible. We have 19 World Heritage inscribed places. We have lots in Queensland. You all know this. I found it a bit interesting when I was looking it up. The Great Barrier Reef is one of our heritage places, which is under threat at the moment. But to be honest with you, we do an exceptional job of managing the Great Barrier Reef. And I think one of the issues that we probably have is that we don't actually spruik that well enough. There are some parts of the Great Barrier Reef, the whole 2,500 kilometres of it, that are under threat. But as a whole, Australia looks after the Great Barrier Reef really well. Much better than most other reefs around the world. So some of the heritage questions that are being asked are actually about our inability to tell people our story. So 51% of all the international visitors asked at the IVS, the International Visitor Survey, which is the survey that the federal government do on exit from an airport, actually identified that they had done cultural or heritage activities during their stay. Growth rate of 2% since 2000. Sounds small, but that's good. They spent $16 billion on trips in Australia in 2009. They haven't, unfortunately, the federal government haven't repeated this piece of research, so I can't give you a figure that's stronger than 2009, which is to do with cutbacks, but that's another story. On average, they spent $6,000 per trip compared to other international visitors, which was $3,000. So they're really important to us, really important, and their length of stay is much longer than other people coming into it. Domestically, so that was internationally. Domestically, 9.3 million overnight visitors, 9.5 day visitors, different. Day visitor, if I go to the Gold Coast from Brisbane, I'm a day visitor. To be an overnight visitor, I should need to stay in that region at an accommodation property. 188 per night, $1,000 per trip, which is much higher. So what I'm trying to say is your customers that come to your properties, your heritage assets, are really important to us. Though they may be small in number, they're really important to us as a state for achieving what we're trying to do. This is a little bit about how old they are. So I don't think anyone would find that surprising, to be honest. Most of the people who know enough about culture have to have a few years under their belt. And the younger ones are probably children whose parents have dragged them along anyway, but that's okay too. But the good thing is that it is actually, as you know, we have an ageing population. So as people move into those ages, we will find that we have more people who have an interest in our cultural assets, in our heritage assets. So why do these people travel? This is what they tell us when we've done our research. If you have a look at those things, you can actually, as a heritage property owner, you can make claim to all of those apart from escaping. The rest of them I think you can lay claim to. So that's a really healthy thing for you to be able to do as well. So as I said in the start, conservation and access are really important. Making memories in special places is one of the things that we talk about when we're talking about heritage. So creating memory. It's the old adage that you can sell a ticket to someone, but you can't sell a memory. The memory has to be taken by that person, and then they retain it, and then they share it. So the most valuable part of that transaction is whether you can influence someone to create that memory, because that's going to be the important thing as far as your asset is concerned and its longevity. And it's to do with built and natural places. Now I just want to have a little minute to chat about Currumbin. It's one of those funny things where we don't do it all that well. As you may know, Currumbin is actually a National Trust product. When talking to Jonathan Fisher, one of the things we're chatting about is the anniversary of Captain Cook coming to Queensland, and it's a National Trust wish that in 2018 we can celebrate the fact that Captain Cook stopped at a whole lot of places to reprovision and to fix his ship as he went up the coast. Now, it doesn't fit neatly into a Tourism Events Queensland. I can't go to the head of brand management, marketing, and say, oh look, just in the lead up there's 8 spots along the coast that Captain Cook touched. Can you just do a campaign? So we need to figure out how we can work out how to celebrate the fact that Captain Cook came here in a sensitive way, because obviously when Captain Cook came, he came as a white visitor to an already existing nation. So it needs to be a sensitive thing. But it's something that we're going to work on. And the reason I put that slide up is that we won't know what your hidden secrets are of all of your properties. Please assume we don't know. So if there's something that's coming up like an anniversary, or if there's something that you've just done some major refurbishment, or you think that there's something that could be an interesting story, you need to feed it through to us. And then we'll feed it through to all the different departments at TEQ and see what we can do. So until I had that chat with Jonathan Fisher, I hadn't realised, because my maths is clearly not that good, that we were coming up to a significant time frame for Captain Cook stopping on the coast. And places like Cooktown, which is a dead giveaway, and 1770, which is another dead giveaway, are probably places that I should have become more aware of, but I didn't. So my call back to you is, don't assume we know anything. Assume we know nothing, and you provide us with all the information you can, and then we'll do our best to try and work out what we can do with it. Of interest to me was Currumbina's in the top 5 most visited National Trust properties in Australia. I didn't know that before I started talking to Jonathan. And as I say, Captain Cook bumped his way along the coast, which was really exciting. Pardon? Don't know. Just is. Don't know. I need Jonathan here, clearly. Yes. Don't know. Does anyone know? You've got a significant anniversary coming up. 250 years. There you go. Oh, it must be 20. It must be 2020 then. See, my math's not that bad. Okay. So yes, 250 years. So it's significant. Yeah, it's good. So the other thing that I thought about, which was of interest to me, was, okay, Therese went over to UK and she got her little book when she was visiting the National Trust properties. Are the UK folk telling anyone that we have these properties? And Jonathan said that a little bit, but not probably as much as they could do. So that's something else that we're going to work with Jane, who's our representative in the UK. We're going to go and get her to knock on the doors of the National Trust in the UK and say, is there anything that we could do together to try and promote some of the Australian National Trust properties, or the Queensland in particular National Trust properties, to all of those thousands of people that join you as a dedicated heritage watcher? So until I had the conversation with Jonathan, that didn't become a thought bubble, and the thought bubble would never go anywhere unless it existed. So again, if I don't know, then I'll never know, and we'll probably miss fantastic, fantastic opportunities just because of the fact that we don't know. People talk about why we're not telling Chinese people about the gold rush, because there's a whole lot of gold rush. There's a whole lot of Chinese people who came over to Charters Towers during the gold rush times. To be honest, we haven't really thought about how we would do that in a culturally sensitive and interesting way, but it's something that's been raised, so we'll look at that. That's something we probably should be looking at. Okay, so as I said, it's really complex. Everyone has amazing websites. We have one, Tourism Australia has one, all of your regional tourism organisations have one. If they don't talk about you and your property in some way, then no one will ever read about you. So having those websites is great, but if they lack the depth of heritage information, we're not doing you any good. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you are on the Australian Tourism Data Warehouse, which is the database of tourism information, then you will feed through to our website, to Tourism Australia's website, to all of our international websites, just by process. If you're not, guarantee you won't. So that's kind of a call back to you, is to say, start talking about yourself in the way that we would normally find you, to make it easy for us. And that's it. And it's a little bit of an over the shop, and I'm apologising by the fact that I can't stand up and say, yes, this person is the manager in charge of heritage for Tourism Events Queensland, because we don't. And we don't have a specialist team of people who even look after specialisations anymore. But we're aware of the fact how important you are, we're aware of the fact that there's some amazing assets around the state, and we're aware of the fact that we need to do something. We are starting to look at drive tourism again. I know, Mark. We are starting to get a partnership together with RACQ about drive tourism. We are starting to look at some projects, and one of them is the 150 things you should do before you die. If there are heritage sites that should be visited before people die, then again, if you don't tell us, you'll never get on the list. So conversation is really important. I can be a conduit. I don't know everything. I clearly don't. I certainly don't sit in most of the worlds around Tourism Events Queensland, but I can find out who might be the appropriate person. So conversation is really important. Information flow is really important. Playing the tourism game is really important, even though we should play the heritage game. So if I can encourage you to let me know when things are happening and give me a bit of notice, and I will certainly do whatever I can to raise the profile of heritage within TEQ and to make heritage one of the must-dos and must-sees for every single person who comes to Queensland into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Therese. That was fabulous, a fabulous insight to the workings of TEQ. I hope you all learnt something from that. Yes. Okay, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. George Seymour is a councillor on the Fraser Coast Regional Council, where he holds a portfolio of community, heritage and family services. He's the chairperson of Maryborough Open House, an annual event that opens up around 30 heritage buildings to the public. George is actively involved in the management of 3 Maryborough museums and the heritage-listed buildings, the School of Arts, the Bond Store and the Customs House. Through his role as the local government representative on the Queensland Heritage Council, George has taken an active role in the preservation of historic sites and the promotion of heritage tourism. Please make him welcome, George Seymour.
Thanks, Jillian. It's a real privilege to be here today amongst so many people who are involved in heritage tourism. I'm from the Fraser Coast Regional Council. We too are also extremely passionate about heritage tourism and really believe in the potential for our region and for the whole of the state. And I really want to thank the State Library for organising this event today. I think it's really important. The Fraser Coast Council is about 3 hours to the north on the Bruce Highway. It takes in all of Fraser Island, which hopefully sometime soon will be known as Gari, which is the traditional Butchla word for the island. They were granted native title about a month ago on the island. Hervey Bay, Maryborough, and the surrounding hinterland area, as well as the coastal villages dotted along the coast. But the geographical centre of the Fraser Coast is very much Maryborough. It was the first settlement for the area in 1847 and defines much of its heritage and history. This is the current City Hall. It wasn't the first one. The City Hall before this is now adaptively reused as the RSPCA op shop. But this City Hall was built in 1908. It's been designed by Robin Dodds. My office is one of the ones down there to the right, the windows. And it was built through the generous donation of £10,000 of a member of the public, something which we don't see very often. And certainly it's on Kent Street in the CBD. We have a number of streets throughout Maryborough which are extremely well preserved. They look almost exactly like they did a century ago. These include commercial streets, industrial streets, streets that represent wealthy houses and gardens, more compact workers, cottages. But my favorite street in Maryborough is Wharf Street. And this picture was taken from the post office tower in 1891. But if you went there today and took a photo from the exact same point, it would look almost identical. As the name suggests, this street is very much linked in with what was happening on the river at the time. Maryborough was founded as a port to get originally wool out, but later coal. It was the second busiest immigration port on the eastern seaboard, just behind Sydney. And there was a great deal of shipbuilding for a long time. And this street, all the buildings along it reflect that association with the port activities. This is one of the buildings. This is the Bond Store. Again, it wasn't the first Bond Store. This one was built in the early 1860s. It's owned by the council, and upstairs we have the Bond Store Museum, and then downstairs you can see there's a very interesting space, the basement, which gets flooded almost every year. We use the downstairs for ghost tours, also history talks, and wine and port tasting. Then very closely associated with that, this is the Customs House. Again, not the first Customs House. This one was built in 1899. The architect was John Smith Murdoch, who built a number of really important buildings right across the continent, including Old Parliament House in Canberra. As you can see there between the two photos, it's very much unchanged. This is probably my favorite building in Maryborough. It's Very interesting, so it's sort of Federation-style arts and crafts combined with real respect and reverence for tradition, classical style, with imperial motifs and the royal crest. In the background, you can see on the far right, you can see two chimneys. That's to do with an associated building, built obviously at the exact same time. That's the port residence, another building that we own where we lease it out as a restaurant. Wharf Street, I think, must have the highest concentration of heritage-listed buildings in the country. You see there on the right-hand side the bond store, then we have a courtyard, then the port residence, then Customs House, then estate government offices. In the background you can see the courthouse and Queen's Park, all of which are on the State Heritage Register. These buildings are also associated with the port activities. They're the warehouses built in the 1860s and have been adaptively reused. That picture there on the left is a little bit out of date because we bought that building. It was for sale, and we've turned it into an art space for printmakers as well as art classes. In the background is Gallagher's Art Space, the Regional Art Gallery. On the far right, the blue building is another warehouse, which is the Maryborough Military and Colonial Museum, private museum, which is really the best military museum outside of Canberra. This is another building owned by the council. It's known as the Heritage Centre, but it was built in 1877 as the Bank of New South Wales. During the Gympie Gold Rush, a lot of these buildings, especially the grand ones, reflect the enormous prosperity that was brought to Maryborough as the port for the Gympie Gold Rush, in which more than 4 million ounces of gold passed through the safes of these banks. Now it is leased by the council downstairs to the Family Heritage Institute and upstairs to the Maryborough and District Family History Society. The downstairs group, they both do a lot of family history and help people research their own genealogy as well as put out books. But downstairs, what they're focusing on lately is we're coming up to, and we've been going through a number of 150th anniversaries of boats which came directly from the UK and elsewhere into Europe, into Maryborough. So they write a book about the people who were on board, they contact the descendants, and then we have a large gathering of people from all over the country and the world come to learn about their ancestors and do recreations, which is a great way of getting people interested in their history. The upstairs group as well also organize a lot of books and also do a lot of the tours, like the cemetery tours. This is another image taken from the post office tower, although this one focuses more on the courthouse, which was built in 1877. The designer was F.D.G. Stanley, another major architect of the period. I actually moved to the Fraser Coast to work as a lawyer, so I have a lot of associations with this building. It is exactly as it was throughout its life. And is very beautiful. That area to the side, exactly facing Wharf Street, is no longer a courtyard with mature vegetation, because in the late 1930s, the state government offices were built there. This is one of the newer buildings in the street and is a really good example of the interwar Georgian revival style. This building, although much less grand than most of the other ones, is a perfectly preserved 1860s shop, which is still being used for its original purpose. So that complements the street. This building in the center is the Criterion Hotel, built in 1878, still operating as a pub. To the left of that is the Waterside Workers' Hall, built by the Maritime Union in 1918 by levying their workers. In Maryborough, we're really keen to ensure that we don't just preserve the heritage of the grand buildings of the aristocracy of the time. We're particularly keen to preserve the workers' heritage, and this building is a very good representation of organized labor. This is the Customs House Hotel. It was built in 1868. The basement was an opium den. It also is still used as a restaurant and pub. This is the far end of Wharf Street. You see on the top left the post office where those photos were taken from. This building was built in 1866 and is the oldest surviving masonry post office in Queensland. It is still used as a post office. Opposite that, you have the Post Office Hotel and then St. Mary's Catholic Church, which was built in 3 stages by 3 very different but significant architects. In the 1860s by Charles Tiffin, about 15 years later by F.D.G. Stanley, and then half a century later by P.O.E. Hawkes, which built who designed many of the lasting buildings in Maryborough. So the council really saw that we had this huge opportunity with Wharf Street. There's a lot of streets like this. This street isn't particularly unique in Maryborough, but it is, I think, one of the best representations we have of an extremely well-preserved 200 or 300 meters of colonial, Victorian, Federation, and Georgian architecture. So we brought it all together. The museums, the businesses, the open spaces, and what you see here, you see that the street's actually surrounded by Queen's Park, which is a very old historic park, and the surrounding streets are also very good architecture. What you see there at the bottom, there's a statue of Mary Poppins, because the author, P.L. Travers, who wrote Mary Poppins, was born upstairs in that bank. Her father was the bank manager. And we have the Mary Poppins Festival, which uses this space. We redesigned the streets to make some of it one way, to make it easier to close it off, so we could have, nanny races for the Mary Poppins Festival and other events using this area, and could slow down the traffic and ensure that it was more pedestrian friendly. We decided to really utilize even though there's no longer a port there, there's no longer shipbuilding, people obviously don't migrate directly to Maryborough, but that was its history, and that's what a lot of the buildings are associated with. So we kind of dubbed the area the Portside Precinct, and gone with a focus particularly on immigration. So instead of people buying a ticket for the Maryborough Military and Colonial Museum, people visiting the art gallery separately or the bond store or the customs house, they can buy one ticket, which is like a passport, which will get them into all of the museums and gives a bit more interpretation and information on the original purpose of Wharf Street. And that's seen a very remarkable increase in the interest both in the individual museums but also in the whole street as a concept, and which we've been extremely excited about year round. But the other aspect of Maryborough I want to talk about is Maryborough Open House. Open House is a concept that dates back a couple of decades. It started in London with London Open House and now has spread throughout the world. Many of you would know about Brisbane Open House, and as well as perhaps Toowoomba Open House. This is a concept where you open up architectural buildings of architectural interest to the public free of charge. In Maryborough, by necessity, it's focused on heritage buildings. So every year we open up about 30 heritage buildings to the public, as well as having public talks, walking tours, bus tours, and other activities. We first held it in October of 2012. And then we held it again in 2013, and this year we moved it into September to help us get a cooler month so people could walk between the buildings. It's a collaborative endeavor. We work closely with the National Trust, who operates Brennan and Garrity's, a really fabulous museum in Maryborough, as well as the Queensland Heritage Council, Department of Environment and Heritage, provides a lot of support, both financial as well as research. And then we get sponsors on board, like the local paper. And of course, Brisbane Open House has been fantastic. By far and away, the most popular buildings, the ones that everybody wants to see, are the houses. Up there on the left is Stirling. More than 1,500 people went through that house in the space of 8 hours on Maryborough Open House. It was just phenomenal. People were so, and that was George Stupart built that house, or he added on to it. He had the department store in Maryborough for many, many years. On the right-hand side is Badow House. That was the house built for Edgar and Maria Aldridge, who were 2 of the pioneers of Maryborough. But aside from, we would love to have just 30 houses, but what we do is we have a whole range of buildings. Certainly the houses are the highest work in terms of you've got an owner who has limitations, and yeah, so we love churches because they provide their own volunteers, but there you have the water filter house, which isn't particularly old. It was built in the 1930s and was used from the 1930s to the early 70s. When the door was shut, all the records were left there, and so I had to open it up for the first time in a long time and clean it out last year. On the right, you have the old powerhouse, which is now reused as a church. And then downstairs, you have a hall and a hotel. So we try and open up landmarks, buildings that people see all the time, but don't actually know much about them. We don't want to make it just about people walking through buildings. It's about experiencing. That picture there is of myself and Ruth Anderson, who's the tower captain at St. Paul's. So throughout the day, we had bell ringing classes. About 200 people learned to ring the church bells at St. Paul's. And that provided a great sort of background music throughout the day that you could hear throughout Maryborough. And people had a lot of fun. Mark mentioned earlier that stories are better than stuff. On the surface, it looks like we're talking about stuff, bricks and mortar, timber and tin, and certainly we have a lot of that. We have a really fantastic collection of Victorian, colonial, Federation, and Georgian architecture. And we have a lot of innovative stuff, like when you drive into Maryborough on the Lamington Bridge, it was the very first concrete bridge in Australia. But in the end, and there are people that are interested in that, but really we're using these buildings to tell stories. Like when you walk into the St. Paul's bell tower there above it, you can't really see it, but there's a stone memorial to Maria Aldridge, who lived in Badow House that I showed you before. Clearly, Edgar loved Maria very much because when she died, he built that, and he built other churches. And so, and what's I think is a lot interesting about them as a couple, but Maria Aldridge was only in the Southern Hemisphere because she was sent to Van Diemen's Land as a convict. I think that is a very unique Australian story, that a very young woman could be packed off by herself across the world in the worst possible position, and then upon her death, the very institute, the Establishment Institute of the Church of England, could be dedicated to her. Similarly, when I give people tours of the Maryborough City Hall, I like to take them up on the stage and get them to stand exactly where Labour Prime Minister Andrew Fisher spoke to monster public meetings in City Hall. Andrew Fisher lived on the outskirts of Maryborough and he worked in the coal mines there. He too only came to the Southern Hemisphere out of necessity. He was essentially banned from working as a teenager in the mines in Scotland because of his union activity. So he came out here and worked and then became a state government MP and then federal government MP and then the Prime Minister. And he didn't go back to his country of birth until he was the High Commissioner. That again is a very unique Australian story that you can tell through the bricks and mortar. I'm probably a bit unusual that my heroes are all, politicians. So when I go to Canberra, I stay at the Hotel Kurrajong, another building built by John Smith Murdoch. And that's where the Labour caucus basically lived for many, many years. So I can sleep in the same rooms that, people whose speeches I've read and whose biographies I've read slept, where Chifley actually died of a heart attack. He lived there instead of the Lodge when he was Prime Minister. And then when I go to, I might be unusual that my heroes are politicians, but I think there is this interest in these historical figures. Because say, Old Parliament House is extremely a popular tourist destination, and it's not because of the architecture, although John Smith Murdoch did have a very unique style. When you go there, people are interested in the toilet that Bob Hawke used. They're not interested in the oil paintings of dead white males. Out the front, there is some extremely nondescript concrete steps, and you can stand out there in the cold, Canberra air and see Lake Burley Griffin, and you see people walk up and down the steps and find a spot and then say to their friends, "Long may we say God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General." And that's a very unique spot. You can stand exactly where that historical moment televised to the nation was. And we don't have those spots everywhere in our towns and cities, but we do have spots that are easily identifiable with local and state significance, and that's really what we're trying to do in Maryborough, bring out those stories that people can experience by standing in areas that are of significance. Every year we try and add a new aspect to Maryborough Open House. Last year, we had an archaeological excavations at the original Maryborough site. Maryborough was originally a few kilometres further up the river. It was founded in 1847 by George Ferber and essentially abandoned in 1854 for the current site. So we held about 3 digs on the day. One was where hundreds of members of the community could participate under the supervision of professional archaeologists. That's the one on the top left-hand corner. The guy in the hat is the Minister for Heritage, Andrew Powell. On the side with the council digger, which I used my influence to get on the day, that's actually digging up, that was testing a hypothesis that the original inn and wharf burnt down in a fire, and we got down to, that's right on the river level, and we got down to the layer of ash. And then on the other small one, that's where we dug up the footsteps going into the inn owned by Edgar and Maria Aldridge. And you see there the rut where the carts of alcohol coming up from the wharf brought into the pub. For a small town of about 300 people, there were a lot of pubs because there were a lot of single men there working, cutting timber, etc. Obviously on the day we have a lot of tours. We have bus tours, walking tours of the CBD, and cemetery tours. Cemetery tours are an extremely good way of telling the history of a town. This year, the aspect that we added was the renovation and restoration displays. So many people in Maryborough live in old Queenslanders, and we wanted to help them learn how to restore their homes, restore furniture, and also research the history of their homes. So we added that this year to help people to learn more about where they're living and their neighborhoods. Next year, we're adding historic gardens. So on the Saturday, we'll have buildings open, and then on the Sunday we'll focus on the role of historic gardens, both market gardens and gardens for pleasure. We wanted to, we're trying to bring in as many activities as possible. I pointed out before one of the warehouses that the council's recently bought. A large part of that is now printmaking studios for a group of people who make prints in a very old-fashioned way. And so on the day, people could make their own souvenirs as keepsakes. This year, as I said, we've moved it into September. It's an event which has become very much sustainable because we've brought in people from right across the community. The historical societies are involved. And it's both Maryborough Open House and the Port Side does a great deal for lifting community pride in Maryborough and a sense of community, as well as bringing tourists to the region. Often when people think of Fraser Coast, they think of Fraser Island and Harvey Bay as whale watching, but we certainly see what we have in Maryborough as an extremely good opportunity for tourism. And I think these two approaches can be very much replicated. Obviously, you have Brisbane Open House and Toowoomba Open House, but we could have Gympie Open House, Cairns Open House. It's an idea that is readily transferable to different towns. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We were talking about passion before, Frontline. George has obviously got a lot of passion for history and Maryborough. Can I invite George and Therese back to the stage, and you'll have the opportunity here again to ask questions. And again, I just remind you to put your hand up and wait for the microphone and introduce who you are as, oops, I don't want to jump ahead too fast. First of all, I'll just start things rolling. The amount of history, the buildings that have survived in Maryborough, how did they survive? Because I don't know many other towns that have that many historical buildings in such good condition.
It's really chance and the not collapse of the economy, but the sort of, we didn't become a ghost town. Basically, Maryborough was extremely prosperous in the early days, partly to the Gympie Gold Rush, also manufacturing and shipbuilding. So we had this great construction period from the 1860s onwards, and then Maryborough didn't build over them. We've kept them. The population has been very, I think in the last 7 years, we've increased by 10 people. So Maryborough, because it was basically the perfect circumstances to preserve the heritage, to become a time capsule, is that we had this early prosperity, And then the port facilities moved. They moved to Harvey Bay, actually, with the Rangan Pier. And with the train line going directly from Brisbane north to Gympie, we no longer became the port. So it was just perfect chance. And then in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a real recognition of the role of heritage.
How did you go about generating so much support within council?
I think there's just a real recognition that as Maryborough has lost industry, there's almost been a recognition that its future lies in its past. We're losing contracts for trains and for other construction, so we're trying to very much bring in heritage tourism.
Could you give some advice on how to perhaps encourage people from another community? How can they get their council to throw so much support behind heritage tourism?
Yeah. Well, we've partly benefited because a lot of those buildings are owned by the council, so that gave us a huge head start. But yeah, I guess it's just about pointing to the successes, and I think getting people passionate about their history and about its role and sense of identity.
And you spoke a fair bit about, or a little bit about open houses. Council sees it as an economic driver, see the value in that?
Yeah, certainly. We have statistics on the day. We have people at the back of each building asking people their postcodes. We marketed it throughout Queensland. We really tried to focus on the drive market. So we wanted people to drive down from Bundaberg and Gladstone and up from Brisbane and spend the weekend. So that's where we focused. And it got extraordinary. That helped partly because we're APN, the regional papers were a sponsor, so we got very good media and brought people to town. The hotels were booked out on the day and the restaurants. So it was about selling it as an economic driver.
Therese, from your point of view, how do you think Maryborough is going and with their approach to heritage tourism?
Oh, it's great. I mean, Maryborough is one of the towns, as there are a whole lot of towns across the state where you do have this really rich heritage background. I guess the difficulty for us when looking at events such as the open house event is one of the things that I didn't mention when I was talking about the whole tourism business is that commission-based selling is actually the way that we get most of our well, it's the distribution chain across the world. So for us to talk to someone in the UK about a heritage open house day in Maryborough, the emphasis that they'll place on delivering that message anywhere will be on what can I make out of it. And that's one of the issues that we have across the state. As long as we have our heritage that's there for all to view free, then it's less likely that we can push that messaging through our distribution networks. Having said that, of course, they're great stories, and those stories are the things that our resident bloggers will just build and pitch out all the time.
Okay, we've got some questions.
Thank you. Murray Stewart from the Queensland Outdoor Recreation Federation. George, I just really want to congratulate the council up there. I was up there recently, and rather than splitting up all the tourism opportunities in, and they brought it all together, and this is latest technology stuff in an app, which everywhere you go up there, there's a little QR code on any of the trails, and you can just put your phone on it, downloads the app, and then it brings up all of the trails, all of the things to do in the area. So Heritage Trail in Maryborough, walking trails in Harvey Bay, wider trails out into the hinterland and things like that. So if there's other councils here, have a look at it. It is really, really good. It's amazing, and I'd bail up Fraser Coast and see if you could maybe give them a couple of dollars and steal the IP off that, rather than everybody inventing their own app and their own things from there. So I don't know how long it's been up or the response has been, but it's absolutely fantastic. Well done. Yeah,
thanks. Yeah, we've tried to create pathways so people don't just go and see the School of Arts building. They don't just see a bank building. They go along, and I'm trying to create more like sort of like there's like in Sydney, there's Radical Sydney, so you can learn about trade union activity. We want to create these different ways. We've done it with immigration. In Bopple, which was, we want people to learn about the mill and about Bopple nuts. And so, yeah, we're trying to create where people would move around and encourage people to stay an extra night by visiting different aspects of the trail.
Another question?
Hi, George. I've just got a question. Because you've got such a strength in 19th century built heritage, how do you not undermine contemporary history in Maryborough?
Mm-hmm.
How do you not paint it that everything interesting happened 100 years ago in Maryborough, that there are still vibrant, interesting things happening worth attention?
Yeah, and that's really hard when you're in these streets and you squint your eyes and it is 1880. We do try and recognize, certainly Wharf Street, one of the other aspects of Wharf Street is we have a square. It's almost like the Hollywood Walk of Fame. We have a square for all these people who were born or came from Maryborough, which is just phenomenal, like the current governor. So we try and tell those different stories so people can walk along. So I'm adding a few next month, and one of them, Mary Hanson, who was in Stereo Lab. Unfortunately, she passed away when she was hit by a bus. But these a lot more recent history, and that is a very tricky question. We also focused a lot on Maryborough's sort of industry. So we have Olds Engineering. People can learn about what happened into the 40s and 50s and 60s. Some of the really interesting buildings that have been preserved, for example, next to the railway station is a bomb shelter, which says on the side, bomb shelter only for use by QR passengers. So there is heritage architecture from the 40s onwards.
Another question?
Yes. I just want to ask Therese, because George is articulating very much that there is a demand for the who we are tourism, and that cultural really investment in who we are, and how Tourism Events Queensland can help councils, to position themselves, or heritage centres to position themselves for that who we are tourism. Because, look at the tours to Gallipoli, that's about who we are. That's why people are going to Gallipoli, not, just Gallipoli or going to Turkey. So, there is that who we are tourism for here in Australia. So how do we position Queensland to do that?
Yep. So as I said, one of the things that is an attractor for Queensland, both nationally and internationally, is our nature, and it's actually the number one across all of our markets. And so that is where the majority of the money is spent. There's nothing else we can say is that, yes, we do unashamedly talk about the beautiful pristine beaches and the gorgeous hinterland up on the Sunshine Coast and the whales at Hervey Bay and the fishing opportunities, because that is what the majority of people coming to Queensland are looking for. So in addition to that, you will always have people who are coming to look at a more personal journey. And there are some, it's nothing that Tourism Queensland drives, unfortunately. It's usually driven from the regional tourism organisation and then fed up through us, and then we act as a promotional mechanism, I guess, for it. So one of the things that I always was astounded by was that Charleville during World War II was an American Air Force base. So the Visitor Information Centre started the push in Charleville to create World War II Air Force Base tours of Charleville. And they sell them, so they're run by the Visitor Information Centre staff, and they're sold out to people. And people come from America in particular, obviously, to come to Charleville to have a look at that, because some of their descendants of their ancestors are no longer living, and so they come and have a look at that experience. Now, once developed, then we can certainly assist in the promotion of that as one of the wonderful things to do and see when you get to Charleville. We don't have the capacity to deliver that experience as the first off. It has to come organically from the region, so from the interest group or from the council. And as I say, in that example, Jane Morgan, who's the manager of the Visitor Information Centre and the Charleville Cosmos Centre, was the driving force for it. She took it to council as an opportunity, and then council then funded some of the development of the experience. So it sounds like a cop-out, but we really are reliant on the networks that are around the state for those networks to develop up and bubble up those experiences. And then when they're ready, we can help them work out how best to promote them.
I might take one more question. Yep.
I'm Stuart Armstrong from the National Trust of Queensland, and I'd like to first of all thank all the speakers that have mentioned us today. That's been fantastic. I'd just like to, there was a question here about Maryborough Open House, and I'd just like to mention that for a second. I had the pleasure of attending that this year, and one of the interesting things about the open house event is that it's not a heritage event, it's a design event, and Maryborough included the Brolga Theatre, and that's potentially a heritage place of the future. And there were people that on the tour that I had were speaking just as passionately about the Brolga Theatre as they were as some of the other early buildings as well, and I think that's a really important component of the open house events. My question for Therese is about your role in government, with you talking about the 4 pillars and the way you talk to lots of government departments. I think we're struggling to get the message of all these great things that are happening into the state government departments and that political sphere. I'm just wondering how we can help you, feed you information about all these wonderful things that are happening so that can work. And the Charleville one that you just mentioned is a great example because it won one of the National Trust Heritage Awards as well. And so we've got all this great information about all these great things happening, and we'd like to share it with you.
Is there a process, Therese, or what can they do?
The most important thing is to have every event or property that's distributable to be on the Australian Tourism Data Warehouse. Mm-hmm. Now, if you are in a regional tourism organisation boundary, a lot of those are free, and some of them have a small fee. But once they're on that database, then they're accessed by everyone. So if you click heritage when you put your information into the database, if one of our national or international media writers are looking for something heritage, they'll search and they'll come up with heritage, and then all of that information will drop down. So that's the most efficient way of actually having everything visible. Then the second thing is, if there's a story happening, we have a media centre group, and any new story we package up and distribute out through our mechanisms. So an example would be, we have a relationship with Reuters International. So with the G20, the story of Obama patting the koala, we package that up into a VNR, which is a video news release, and we put it out through Reuters, and it gets picked up by a whole lot of other countries. And with that example, it's about $6 million worth of worldwide publicity that came from that one tiny little story. When Federer was in town last year for the Brisbane International, he coloured a koala.
Those koalas,
they're
doing
I
the
know.
work for us, aren't they?
Go the koalas. His was worth about $12 million, which kind of says something of the difference between a sports star and a politician. I'm sure that's wrong. But it's one of the things. Now, Bruce Wallace manages the team that looks after those VNRs, and he's always looking for really interesting ideas. So it's information flow, to be honest. We just need the information, and the process is through your regional tourism organisation, who then sends it to us or direct to us. And I just encourage you to keep that information flow coming, and we will use as much of that information as we can, because we're always looking for great things to talk about.
And from a media perspective, we are always looking for something new as well. I'm going to have to leave it there. Are you staying around for lunch? Or do
I'm
you have
coming
to take...
back.
Okay. Well, perhaps if anyone's got any other questions. But thank you to Therese and George. Thank you so much for that session. Round of applause. Okay, now heritage tourism gives us all an opportunity to experience the real Queensland. Our history shapes our state, our heritage defines our character, and through old memories we can create new memories for local and international visitors. Across Queensland is a network of interconnecting stories, all brought to life by objects once used, photographs that give us a vision into the past, and personal stories that link people to others and to a place. As we talk about the possibilities of heritage tourism today, the challenge as professionals working in the tourism and heritage sectors is to find innovative new ways that we can use this knowledge and create new experiences. Earlier today, Jane Cowell mentioned the State Library's Playback Oral History Project. So the State Library of Queensland has partnered with 7 organisations and public libraries to identify and digitise oral histories of local Queenslanders to make this rich content more accessible so it can be reused by others and in different ways. This project has led not only to the digitisation of some wonderful Queensland stories, but also the creation of digital stories, reenactments, community events and tours, among a variety of other outcomes using the digitised history. Unfortunately, we don't have time today to hear of all 7 participants, so the digital story we are about to see is from the Townsville City Libraries, and it's one example of how organisations have shared their digitised oral histories. Oh, sorry, do I just wait for that to play now? Oh. The man in the black shirt. Here we go. Play. Has to work.
Townsville Voices is an audio collection of memories of Townsville. Exploring the collection allows you to understand how Townsville locals experience significant and everyday events in their lives. Listen as they share their memories of life in our changing community.
The war started in 39. Well, it didn't affect Australia much until around about 42 when the Americans started to arrive in Townsville. I don't know how we found out about it, but we knew the American ships, they call them the landing barges. The front of the barge flops down and they just run truck.
Sorry. That was really good. We'll try. Probably a little bit hard to pick up the whole essence. So our apologies, and we'll try again later on today. Some of the Playback project participants are here today, so you just join me in congratulating them. I can assure you it is very good. Thank you so much. Okay. Now, at the recent Destination Q Forum in September this year, one of the 6 commitments made by the Queensland Government and the tourism industry was to partner with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to share their stories and cultures with the world. Queensland's incredibly rich in its Indigenous cultures, and I'm very pleased to welcome our next 2 guest speakers to the stage to explore the key aspects of creating tourism experiences around Indigenous cultural heritage in Queensland. Please welcome to the stage Cameron Costello, CEO of Quandamooka Yoolooburrabee Aboriginal Corporation, and Rory O'Connor, Director of Yugambeh Museum Language and Heritage Research Centre, to the stage, and they're each going to chat to us about what they're doing. Fellas, come up and I'll read your CVs. So, Cameron is a Quandamooka man from Moreton Bay off Brisbane. He's a law graduate from UQ, holds a Bachelor of Arts and Leisure Management from Griffith. Cameron has over 15 years' experience in local and state governments delivering Indigenous policies and programs with a focus on sport, recreation, culture and the arts. Cameron is currently CEO of the Quandamooka Yoolooburrabee Aboriginal Corporation, the native title body for the native title determination over Minjerribah, North Stradbroke Island. And Rory O'Connor here on the left, Director of Yugambeh Museum, Language and Heritage Research Centre at Beenleigh, which works to keep Yugambeh heritage alive in southeast Queensland. In 2013, he coordinated an Indigenous Tourism Action Plan for southeast Queensland and a joint museum federal government initiative. Through this, he was able to assist with the funding and development of Dream World Corroboree, the first Indigenous attraction in an Australian theme park, which created 17 Indigenous positions and won the 2014 Premier's Award for Reconciliation in its opening year. Now, Rory's currently creating a bunyip hunt tour to be delivered through the Beenleigh Historical Village and Museum next year, teaching language and culture to thousands of young visitors every year. Please make them welcome. I'm going to sit in the middle this time. I'll start with you, Rory. Tell me about what you're doing.
What's the time?
You've got enough time. You've got 4 minutes.
What is the time?
12:35.
12:30, thank you. I just want to say Balgal Yuan, which is good afternoon in language, and Minigu, which is g'day in our language. And I've not met this man before today, so it's great to sit up here with a very famous bloke from our community. I'm very proud to be here. And you asked a question, sorry.
Just tell me what you're doing. What are you up to?
Oh.
What's new?
Oh, goodness. Okay. What we've noticed is people want accessibility to Indigenous stories and culture. And for me, if Jaron dancers were sitting here, and Graham Blanco's a fantastic dancer, dance was the way a lot of our stories were told. And what we're finding more and more is people want accessibility through sharing stories, whether that's sitting down and talking, doing some weaving while we hear a story, or, the things we do. They want access to stories in a way that the tide has turned. And when my mother was younger, Aboriginality was something you didn't really talk about. Whereas now, the kids want it, and they demand it. They want to know the story of Mount Tamborine because, that's where they live now. They're Australians, and my role is to go, okay, I'll share what I can with you.
Cameron, would you agree with that?
Yeah, there's a growing thirst for engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their culture, and I think when that lady said about who we are, I think the collective Australian public see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture as part of the national identity, and they want to engage with that and find out more about it, and it's so rich yet so unknown, and I think that's what the opportunities that lie out there for us at the moment.
What projects have you got on?
What's
taking your attention at the moment?
Apart from my native title stuff on my Quandamooka country, which everyone knows where that is, it's like from the mouth of the Brisbane River down the coastline. The Quandamooka coast runs from the mouth of Brisbane River down to Cleveland, Logan River, and takes in the Moreton Bay Islands. So Murrugumpa, which is Moreton Island, Minjerribah, North Stradbroke Island, South Stradbroke, all the Bay Islands in between. So it goes across 4 local government areas. So at the moment we're looking about how we can look at the heritage tourism opportunities on country. In addition to that, I've chaired the Cairns Indigenous Art Fair, which is, I guess, a cultural tourism event that runs each year and celebrates Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and wanting to take the arts to the world. And so that's a major event that happens on the wharves in Cairns, where we have international arts collectors come out, and also a whole range of opportunities for the public to engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from all over Queensland, and so that's another thing. And I guess the other thing is I was chair of the Stratty Camping, which is runs the 6 caravan parks and camp beaching on North Stradbroke Island, and so we went into a partnership with Indigenous Business Australia 2 years ago, and so that tourism accommodation provider has I think 30,000 campers a year, and that's turned from being a council-run facility that wasn't making any money now to a profitable entity where Amity Campground got the the best holiday park in Queensland last year, and the motto for that now is Feel the Spirit of Quandamooka Country. We employ over 50% Quandamooka people, so when you're picking up the phone, you're quite likely to be talking to a Quandamooka person, and that's kind of a unique and has really value added to the tourism product.
Aboriginal tourism experiences may have been seen by the industry as being difficult to establish. So how have you addressed some of those challenges, Cameron, and what do you think are the key aspects of success?
Yeah, look, I think one of the key challenges for us is that in Moreton Bay, historically, like every other aspect of industry, we've been, I guess, excluded from the industry historically. So the two challenges were one about a level of apathy, I guess, towards tourists coming over to Stradbroke Island. We've always been excluded, so overcoming that internally, but also there's a lot of really great tourism operators out there that are really keen to engage with Aboriginal people about partnering with their products and stuff, but they're also quite fearful of if they're accused of not doing it properly, that actually damages their brand. So they're two of the key things about, and really I think just a coordinated approach to how you want to do tourism on country. I don't know if there's been that kind of coordinated approach internally. And as with all tourism ventures, it takes someone with entrepreneurialism, drive, get up to drive it forward. So I think that's what we're starting to see now. I think there's a lot of restrictions being removed on Quandamooka people's and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people socially as well, to allow them to get into that space.
Rory, what challenges have you seen and how have you overcome them?
Should I talk about that?
Sure.
Okay. And I guess what this man's saying here has been our journey too. What have we got there? I'm sorry, I don't know what slides are actually sent in. Okay, there we go.
Talk about bunions.
I guess my stories in the tourism space started in the 90s, where I left the Sunday Sun and Channel 9, Jillian. And I joined Tourism Queensland and got to work all around the world in the London office as well for Tourism Queensland. But in 2000, actually it began when I was a little boy. And my mum was chopping carrots in our kitchen, and I was in that kitchen just the other day. So over 4 decades ago, mum's chopping carrots, and there's a little wood fire in the corner over there. And I'd won a race at school, and I said, "Mum, I won a race at school." I was 5 years old or something. She said, "Oh, you should be a good runner. Uncle Drumley was a good runner," blah, 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 all about Uncle Drumley. And I was very proud because my brother gave me an axe, and I went up the backyard and chopped wood for the said fire. And Mum said, "Oh, you should be good at chopping wood because Uncle Drumley was a..." And her body posture would change when she would do this, because Uncle Drumley was clearly a person of great character within the community. As I grew older, I became the tribe scribe. I was a journalism student, and Mum would drag me around to meetings, and I'd interview lots of our old folk, and unfortunately they've moved on since. But whenever they spoke of Drumley, they too, their body posture would change, and you'd see it when they speak of the olds, I call them. Oh, Sess, he was a... And one of the stories that really emerged for me was Drumley would come and visit. Mum was born in Bedesert, in the Aboriginal community there, but she went to live at an early age with her grandmother in a grandmother's house in Southport. Her grandmother was born in the 1860s. Now, these were harsh times. The native police were going crazy back then. You got shot. It was not a good place. This young woman, her grandmother, was tribally scarred. Mum grew up in her house hearing her stories. When the old lady would have visitors over, she would close the door when she had wanted to sing or dance so the little kids wouldn't see it because they'd be removed under the Act. Mum shared those stories with me as a little fella, and one of those stories was Drumley would walk from Bedesert to Southport and he'd visit, and she loved those visits, and the kids did, because he'd bring bunny, a kidney for the kids. And Mum said, "Oh, it's great, it tasted like greasy chicken." Anyway, so I'll go overseas and I work and I come back and I think, well, I want to show my respects to those old men and women that I did not know. And if it wasn't for them, Drumley had a mantra. As a young person, you go to school and also you work. And that was a way of not being removed from your country. And Neville Bonner, our first Aboriginal parliamentarian, federal parliamentarian, a senator, he attributed his only 1 year of schooling to the year he lived in what is now Drumley Lane with Drumley. So in 2005, I tried to gather people together to do this walk once. It was just me and my brother, my cousin actually. And we realised the old traditional routes that Drumley used to walk had turned into horse carts and tracks and roads and now a highway. And so we'd be walking along a flaming highway. And I was letterbox dropping people saying, "Look, this sounds a bit weird, but I want to walk through the front of your property because we want to do this thing." And it was all very difficult to explain. But I got a phone call. And it turns out this man was the ex-mayor of Bedesert and quite, a right-wing sort of gentleman. If Michael was here, he wouldn't disagree with that. And he said, "What's this about, son?" I think he used the word son. And I said, "Oh, we just want to do a tribute walk one time." And he said, "Who's it for?" And I said, "Drumley." And there was a long pause. I think it went for a year on the phone, and I was dying because... And he's not Billy Drumley? And I said, "Yes." And he said, "That man was very well known in this community. You won't be walking through front yards. you are going to walk through our property, and if you wait till after 6 o'clock tonight, you ring the Ludwigs, they'll open up their front gate for you, you can walk through them. And then when you get to Mount Tambourine, that family up there don't like me because I've got a quarry, but they'll open their gates for you too. Give them a call, and before I knew it, this town had opened up so we could do a heritage walk. Now that was 10 years ago next year, and our community has been on this journey ever since. My cousins thought I was mad. They said, who's going to want to do this? And we had the mayor and about 30, 40 people come to the start of that day by a flagpole in Bethesda, the Billy Drumley carved for the celebration of the end of the First World War. And every year now, our community has gathered together to produce this crazy walk, and it's insane. You know, we camp wherever we can, we sleep wherever we can. I run it, so it's not well organised.
So how does it look?
Well, what's happened is, in Queensland Events, I must thank them, actually, because they gave me a job, and for 7 or 8 years, I had a credit card and a computer, and my job was to travel to tourism spaces in Queensland and write about them, and then invite Getaway up and host them on my credit card. I love that mob,
Good.
they're great. It was work, you know. But also, they, through their events funding, they funded the Drumley Walk because they were trying to figure out too, what could this mutate into? And I guess it's been a journey for us because you don't make money out of a walk. And when you're relying on your cousins and your rallies who are volunteers, and some of them are mad, it's always entertaining, but it's not something you can productise, if you like. And as we know, on the tourism chain, to sell something to a market in London, you need to be going here and selling 18 months out. So we didn't have that product, and we're an event, so we're not a product. So, but what we've then developed is we thought, hang on, we realised these people they were coming from everywhere to come with us, and our survey said they wanted 3 things. They wanted camaraderie, they wanted to share stories, and they wanted to meet an Aboriginal person. And you know, Cameron, you'd be the same. You think, why are you going to meet an Aboriginal person? Yeah, because we're not used to the fact that they don't have access to what we take for granted.
That's a good first contact on SBS.
Oh yeah, well, I can't believe that. Anyway.
That's a whole nother discussion, isn't it?
But it's like rabbit-proof fence. I never saw it, and when people said, "Wow, that was really amazing," to me, I didn't get it. I thought, didn't you know that? Because we grew up with that as part of our story. But just quickly, so the walk grew, and it, won awards and did lots of things. But most importantly, it brought our community along this journey to go, hey, we have to get skilled up to share our stories. And then the little barbecue at the end, I think we had 40 people the first year, it started to grow. And this was in 2011. We think we had 2,000 people come to the end of the Drumley Walk. It was like, and my cousins got there and they said, what have you done? I don't know. But it was getting too big for our little organisation to run. And that's where we started thinking hard about, what does tourism look like? And the mob north of ours, and we're quite closely related. And so I spoke to some of the Stratty mob too. This is the Tourism Action Plan that Martin Ferguson helped fund. And we had 3 pillars in our strategy, actually, which was a very clever thing to do, I thought. Have pillars, wouldn't you say?
Everyone needs a pillar.
Yeah, Campbell Newman's got it.
At least 4.
We had 3. We weren't that well funded. But the first thing we realised was the brand, Yugambeh. No one's heard of it. There's 500,000 people live on the Gold Coast, 330 live in Logan, about 50,000 live in Scenic Rim. Yugambeh brand has to be publicised. So part of that was we developed an app so kids can type in, what did I just look at? Swan, because someone mentioned black swan, and Dulai. And so we launched the country's second app. In fact, the Curtin University gave us an award for that, so we're very grateful there. The second thing was partnerships. We realised we needed partnerships because if you're a small Aboriginal organisation, you might be able to bring the cultural content, but you're not any good at running a bus company, and that's a whole new challenge. And that's where the Dreamworld connection came in, because they were part of our advisory team. They wanted to launch a RAP, and we were able to introduce Dreamworld to the Federal Minister for Tourism, because they couldn't get access to him, and that's when he went, we should fund the Dreamworld Corroboree experience. So that's created 17 Indigenous jobs, and it's the first Aboriginal attraction in an Australian theme park. A very very complicated thing to negotiate. 23 Aboriginal communities involved with it. And I had to say to their chairman, who oversees more than $1 billion worth of assets, blackfellas don't trust companies, mate. They may trust a person in the company, and I was as blunt as that, you know. And would you agree?
Yeah. I mean, we ended a partnership with Indigenous Business Australia for strategy camping, and that was a massive step for our community as well, to actually go into partnership with a large company or government agency or whatever. So,
I think we are chewing into lunchtime at this point. I'll just ask for some quick, if anyone has any quick questions for Cameron or Rory. No, well, we might. So I'll just throw something to you, Cameron. I mean, we heard about Destination Q, the forum, and their commitment to partner Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to share their stories with the world. So that's their commitment. But what does that mean, and how does that get put into practice from your point of view?
yeah, I think there's a few opportunities heading into the next few years that it's as simple as engaging or contacting your local Aboriginal community about, if you're a tourism operator that, for example, on Straddie does kayaking, how they can come and work with us to value add to their product. Might be simply about the terminologies or phrases or the background of that they're using. Recently over there, the barge company had Aboriginal artwork put on their vessel. It's about, I guess, making that initial step and contact, particularly heading into the Commonwealth Games in the next few years. I think up at the Destination Q, I was pitching about, Aboriginal designed uniforms for volunteers for the Commonwealth Games. So there's just a massive amount of opportunity. But for me, what I'm doing is proactively looking at how I can link in with the various island communities and sit down and just have a conversation and map some stuff out about what are some really simple, quick things that we can do that don't cost any money. It's about simply doing what we're already doing out there, but how do we just include Aboriginal culture within that? And it might be, if you're an accommodation provider, it might be an Aboriginal design or an Aboriginal print on your walls, because it's really needed. Because at G20 we got a call from the Brazilian consulate because the president, Rousseff, came out and they had one look at their hotel in the city and just went, this isn't befitting of the president of Carnival. So they got some of our Aboriginal artwork from Straddie and placed it all throughout her suite, in the meeting room where she had with Putin and China and India. So it's those simple things about how we can do it. I think with heritage tourism, it's about looking at how we can also get the complete picture. St Helena Island, Peel Island, they've all got a big colonial history, but the Aboriginal history of that is so rich and dense as well. Those islands are quite sacred, they're part of dreaming stories. How do we link that into the complete narrative to enhance the visitor experience? So I think there's a whole range of opportunities, too many to list here, but I just wanted to point out the other thing is that, having applied for grants and heritage grants, there needs to be a shift in what heritage is. I've found it very difficult to get funding for protecting Aboriginal cultural heritage because it's about built infrastructure. So you've got a building that's 200 years old, but we can't get funding to put interpretive signage for a 3,000-year-old midden site, 3,000 years old. You know what I mean? So those kinds of things I think we need to look at as well.
So you'll be hanging around for a while?
Lunch.
So I'm sorry to wrap that up so quickly, but I'm sure the fellas will be happy to chat to you if you've got any questions over lunch. But thank you so much for your insights today. Rory and Cameron, please. We're back at 1:30 for the next session. Thank you.